Irish time, which means that if you arrive 10 minutes late or 15 minutes late, it's usually only getting going. That's great. Monachan means little monk, is that right?
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. Most, I mean, it's hard to know. Like there's a saint in Limerick, Munchin. It could be an Irish version of that, or I think what in my book I go on that it could be something to do with the Mongan, the son of Manannán mac Lir. But any of those old names, as you know, trying to even work out what the actual name of the deity that was in the Shannon River is. It's really hard to work these things out.
Yeah.
But potentially, most likely is this little monk. Yeah.
Yeah. And just so that we can get the sort of biographical information, you grew up in Dublin, but you kind of had you had two sort of separate lives. You had one in Dublin and you had one in the southwest. And of course, it would appear from reading your book, that's where you got your great love of the language. When was your first sort of foray into, I think it's Kerry, isn't it?
Yeah. So let's say my great granduncle was the O'Reilly, and then my grandmother was Sheila Humphreys. And the O'Reilly was from North Kerry. He was from Ballylongford, just outside Listowel. And he decides in about 1909 or 1912 that he is going to devote himself to fighting for Ireland and for the Irish cause and for Irish culture and Irish language. So he moved down to the Blasket Islands then in 1912. I mean, he'd spend the summers there with my granny and the whole family. And with the family have been going there ever since. Like, I mean, they went to the Blaskets just for the first maybe 3 or 4 years. Then they built a house in Ventry in West Kerry. And then my granny and her mother and her aunt built a house in a bit further out in Mariach and Ballydavid, so where Radio Gaeltacht is. And so we've always had the summer house, and I, since I was 0, have been going there and spending about a quarter of the year there. The 3 months of summer, and then a time in spring, it's time in Christmas and time in Easter. So there was that world, and then the alternative world in Donnybrook in Dublin.
And they must have been two very different worlds.
Yeah, totally. They like leagues across. It's only, I then spent a lot of time traveling in the 90s, and it was only then I realized that the world I had access to in West Kerry was so special, was so rare. It was a world where every day I would see the local farmers bring their milk, which was in milk churns on the back of a horse and cart, down past my house, from Balliningall to Mariach, and then across Troy Galleras, the Troy Marig, to the creamery, to the Uchterlin over in Riask. Every day, just going on a horse and cart along. That would have taken them, an hour away. Then they would have waited there as the milk was unloaded, chatted at the Uchterlin, at the creamery, and then come back again. And that was the morning's work. And then, like, if we ever needed anything in the shop, if we needed anything brought up to the post office, you just gave it to one of those horse and carts, and they'd bring it up. So it was such a unique world. That was the 70s. A world obviously without cars. People had tractors. Sometimes a few people would go to mass on tractors. But there just wasn't very many cars. There wasn't very many signs of modernity. So it was really valuable to be immersed in that world while, as you say, the world in Donnybrook was so different.
Yeah, my first introduction to you was on George Hook on News Talk, and you seem to have been incredibly well traveled. And I think, isn't there something about sort of traveling that makes you realize how special your home place is?
Yeah. So, like, I traveled because I just found Dublin in the 1990s and the 80s when I was a teenager and in my young 20s, just so confining. So I needed to get out. I wanted to find a different perspective. And so I would spend a lot of time, my first, year in Africa, then maybe a year in South America, 2 years in South America running an organic farm. And then I went up to the Himalayas and spent a lot of time there. And I realized, God, the majority of the world were living in this simple subsistence way of life, a way of life that hadn't maybe changed for 2,000 years. And it reminded me of some of the elements I saw in West Kerry. Like, clearly life in Kerry had changed a lot over 2,000 years, but there were some elements like the idea of the mehel, like the idea of saving the hay in the traditional way, like the idea when I'd go to Balliningall, to the Collin, Balliningall, there would be maybe 12 or maybe up to 20 nave ogs, 20 currachs. The same boat almost that we might have landed here 4,000 or 5,000 years ago was still being used with nets to catch salmon at the time, but also crab and lobster and pollock. So the majority of the world live that way of keeping, if not the ancient, at least some medieval customs and traditions alive. And if we were born into that mindset, and so many of us were, and if not our grandparents were, then it's no wonder that we feel a bit alienated by everything that has happened since. So for me, it was reassuring to go and spend time in Ethiopia or in Nepal or wherever else, where you would see life at that pace, where it is still connected to nature, connected to rituals, connected to the land.
And of course, we've lost that to a great extent, especially I think more so on the eastern side of the country in what we might call the Pale. I'm certainly sort of acutely aware of that in my own situation because I'm not much of a Gaeilgeoir, which is a great regret. And in fact, I'm determined now, and that's one of the things I wanted to say by way of introduction, that your book, I think it might be a modern day Sanas Cormac. In fact, I think it might be more important to the current age than Sanas Cormac has been to those who have studied the language for the past millennium. You have managed to tell us about the language in a way that really sings. It's a very soulful book. It's not just an exposition. It's not just an examination of where we are with the language. You get into the whole musicality of it, the resonance of it, the depth of it, and I gather that word soulfulness comes to mind. There's a couple of things that I wanted to read for people, just in case some of the people who are here haven't actually seen or read Monaghan's new book, 32 Words for Field, Lost Words of the Irish Landscape. I read it in the past week and I wanted to read it so that it was fresh in my mind when we were chatting to you. And I can honestly say it's one of the best books that I've got in the library, and it's going to be a great treasure for me. So just by way of introduction, one of the best quotes in the book, as far as I'm concerned, and there are many, and by the way, Manchán, if you don't mind me saying, you're a master of the English language as much as you are the Irish language. Your English is so lyrical, it's so descriptive. The language, Irish, is built on an acceptance of unknowable realms and dimensions. That's something we would be acutely aware of, is the fact that it seems that life in Ireland, perhaps not modern city or town life, but certainly traditional life, was imbued with this sense that there was another world that was always ready at any moment to spill into this one. And I think you capture that magnificently. Another quote on page 130, the notion of the principal location that one went out to was a field or field is a lovely thing. And on page 362, I only read that this evening, we used to believe profoundly in the power of thought to influence life. So this is much more than a collection of words. It is a wonderful a wonderful exploration. Your book is filled with a melancholy, also a sense of loss, of language that has faded into history. You talk about this word, I think it's irvaracht, a sense of loss or alienation that could coincidentally describe the COVID-19 lockdown and a sense of isolation too. I'll get to the questions in a moment. This is a panegyric and you deserve it. I have been saying for a long time now that some of our myths are very ancient. This is a lifelong belief of mine, Manchán. And then I read your assertion that the waves of Irish myth could be folk memories of glacial events of 10,000 years ago. And I punch the air and shout, yes! And I'm reading all over the place fabulous references to mythological and folklore stories and memories. For instance, I read about the magical shield. Is it Ochain? And its ability to roar with distress. And then I remembered that recently in the metrical Dinshanachus, I read about Ochan, which is the name of the place to which the Dagda retired after he was dispossessed of Sheed and Browgar or Newgrange by his son Angus. And there's a distinct reference to, is it mourning or complaining or grumbling, because basically he's lost the brew. Anyway, I hope I haven't made you blush too much. Could you tell us a little bit more about the idea of Chanter versus altar, Chanter being a region or locality, or as you say, this world, and altar being the netherworld or the other world, because I think that's very important.
Yeah, and I will. And just in response to what you're saying, like you mentioned that thing of amach, of the idea of amach, which everyone knows, like, well, cadagum dul amach, imig amach, the teacher would say, would throw you out of the class, amachas and round. And that, as you referred to there, was amach means mach, at mag or mach, out into the field. So the idea of going out, as you said, was going out into the field. Only the last few days I've been thinking, like the few other words that everyone will know, like ine and inyov. Ine yesterday, inyov today. What do they mean? Ine, in dia, in God, in yov, in yov, or in you, in diu, in God. They're basically like, we are so impressed when we go to India and they say, namaskar or namaste. They acknowledge the God in you. The very way we say today and yesterday is about God is with us. And people often think this is some sort of Christian God, that when we say Deus, we used the Irish accepted that word day or Deus, a Latin word, when the Christians came in, but it didn't mean in any way that we accepted that God. I mean, as your website is so full of, there was so much continued understanding of gods and goddesses and a pagan mentality, so that it even stayed alive in those words. So what I was trying to capture is exactly, in fact, the same thing that you have been doing for so long with your website, realizing there is this amazing amount of lore that has stayed alive in the landscape, in our minds, in our folklore, in the language. And that for many of us, we had tuned out of it, or at least a certain realm of academics had made sure that we weren't focusing on it. Like at the moment, I'm writing a second book, a new book, and today I was looking at the Shannon River. So it's a book about landscape. And you know the way you look at the Boyne, and I touch on the Boyne in the book, or you can touch on the Shannon, and they both have a similar, birth story. The Shannon, the goddess of the Shannon, or the god of the Boyne, the god of the Boyne, go to a sacred well, and then they somehow they're going looking for answers. They're looking for knowledge in the sacred well. And then the well overtakes them because of their curiosity. Some 19th century translations will sort of blame the female for having been curious, for having wanted to know too much, and so she was washed away, which is clearly a 19th century inference of women get back into your place. This is a message for what happens when women get uppity and get knowing things. So unfortunately, the knowledge that we have, and I mean, we haven't referred to it, but two of my relations were Celtic scholars. So T.F. O'Reilly, the man who came up with the whole concept of the double or the three different St. Patrick's, and then Cecil O'Reilly, his sister, who translated the first Táin Bó Cúailnge. Wonderful people, but people of their time, and they were slightly more open-minded. They were off the charts intelligence. Unfortunately, my strand of the family, I'm descended from their first cousin, Michael O'Reilly, the O'Reilly, who had very little, average intelligence, which I got. But that other side, the Cecil and TF, they were off the charts. So they weren't quite as limited as some of the other clerics who translated the works. But we were fed a version of the folklore through a 19th century, slightly conventional Christian mindset. And what your website has been doing for so long is trying to say, yeah, they did valuable stuff, but don't accept everything. Try and use your imagination. Try and feel your way around a site like the Lia Fall or the Baltray Standing Stones or now to understand something more. So although you were kind about my writing, we know that I am no expert in anything. So, and although my book is somewhat important, just because it's the first of a new generation, like you've been doing this for many years now, and my book, had it come out last year, so my book, it's about the Irish language and the insights we can get into our land and landscape through the Irish language. Had that book come out last year, no one would have talked about it, really. I the publishers expected we might sell about 5,000 copies. I thought, yeah, nothing would happen for about 6 months, and then some people will read it and get somewhere. And instead, because everything has changed in this year because of COVID, but also because energetically, a lot of people over the last few years have been doing work to rise this energy, to rise this consciousness. And not only people are doing work, but instinctively, people are beginning to question. They no longer have that same sense of certainty that shopping or television or social media is going to provide the answers. So they want deeper things. And luckily my book came along at the right time. But it's going to be the first of very many TV projects, podcasts, books, more websites like yours that will develop all this. I know I haven't answered your counter and alter, and I will if you want me to.
Well, I just wanted to say you're very modest in relation to your own intellect, and I have to say I refuse the deflection in that case. You are a man who, as well as being very erudite, is also obviously very modest. In relation to what's happened in the past year, interestingly, and this is none of the questions I've asked so far are actually on the sheet. We've the potential to go down many different rabbit holes, as you probably are aware. One of the things about the past year is that perhaps people have been suddenly forced to confront that field that is the space that they occupy. Maybe it's their front or back garden. Maybe it's that acre of land behind their house that they don't get to see so much of because they're stuck in traffic jams, racing to and from stressful jobs. And so all of a sudden we have this very different scenario. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that perhaps, and just getting back to the question, that people perhaps because of the situation may become slightly more aware of that altar, that other world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, we do need to answer the counter and alter question, but just to say, yes, of what you're saying, but two things are happening at the same time, possibly. One, COVID has made us have more time to look around, but I do believe, we laughed in the 1970s and 80s when we heard about this idea of the age of Aquarius, and it was so much of New Age belief was put across in such a crass, ridiculous way that we sort of dismissed it. But it does seem that there is an awareness opening up in people as well, that we are surprised by where these urges are coming from. Like all of these people who are swimming. I live in the Midlands, and there are now people swimming in the Midland lakes. We have never done that for the last 10,000 years since we first inhabited this island, or our predecessors came here. Nobody has been swimming in the Midland Lakes. There's an urge grasping us now. It's to do with COVID, but it's to do, I would warrant, a lot more than that. Back to your question, counter, agus, alter. What do these mean? So counter is a district. It's a region. Everybody knows, Shoheim counter. This is my district, my region, my place. And then alter is the opposite of that. And it was only, I knew the word counter. And then when I came across alter, and I thought, wait there, they are connected. Alter is the opposite of counter. And alter is the other world, the nether world, the other realm. And again, it's no new fact. It's no revelation for us to say that there was always a belief in the other world. We know from our grandparents' generation, as I say in the book, my mother saw a leprechaun when she was young in West Kerry. It was just a normal. I remember my bank manager in AIB in Baggot Street in Dublin, he sat me down a few years ago and he started talking about the fairies around his field in Mayo and the bits of the bog they don't touch. It's just normal. And I remember for St. Patrick's Day a few years ago, I did an Irish Times article where I contacted the ESB and the AA and banks and all and asked them what their attitude was to the fairy realms and to fairy consciousness and all. And all of them, very few of them sniggered. We still know it's an ancestral thing. For thousands of years, we have believed that there is more than the physical reality, that there's this other dimension, which is just a thin veil away. And I think in the book, I refer to that word, Pukin. So if counter is this region and alter is the opposite, and people understood that there was only a thin veil between them, and some people were able to go from counter to alter. So, and one way of doing this was with the Pukin. And a Pukin means a supernatural being that becomes invisible a supernatural cloak that allows an otherworldly being appear invisible in this world.
We would know that from the mythology as Faith Fiada.
Exactly.
Or something similar, yeah.
Yeah. And there are other meanings of Pukin that people know. Pukin means a blindfold, and it means a goat muzzle, and it means the thin shield that you put over a thieving cow's eyes as well to stop her stealing.
Yeah, this is the incredible depth of the language too that I gleaned from your book. I have to say, Manchán, something I didn't mention was that in 2005, I was gifted the Dineen Folklore, and as you can see, it has seen better days. And this is one of the best gifts I ever received. At the time, I think it cost €50. It was an expensive gift. And poring over the pages, something that struck me about this was that this was not like any folklore I had ever seen, because for every word, there seemed to be a huge swathe of explanations and even circumstances in which that word could be used, you know? I mean, I'm just opening on a random page, right? Dúchas, D-U-T-H-C-H-A-S. Nature, innate, intrinsic or ingrained quality, instinct, natural bent, heredity, ancestral stock or estate, one's home estate, district or country, etc., etc. And it goes on for another half a page. And I just thought, if this was a glimpse into another world, an older world, this was the kind of world that I wanted to inhabit. And I think it's the kind of world that you clearly inhabit from reading your book.
What people want, they want that in the past, we wanted safe answers. We wanted 0 or 1. We wanted yes, no. People now want yes, and. They want those other opportunities. And something your website has done is collected. So you do 2 things. One, you take photos of solid objects that are in the landscape, and that's pretty confined and understanding. But this other work you do of collecting up the old stories, and the stories, the folklore, and particularly some of the accounts you have on the website, they're just impossible to corral or to put into a box or to put into any type of limitation. And they don't make full sense. They don't make logical sense. And, you know, our world since the era of enlightenment for the last 100, 200, maybe 250 years has wanted confinement, has wanted rational, linear sequences. And our folklore don't give that. You know, the key element of the Gaelic world was this, and particularly of sacred things, was that there were 3 of everything. You know, there was a goddess had 3 different names, had 3 different forms. The place had 3 different forms. So the minute when you tell me, when I say that the ochon, the shield, is a shield that is also connected to a wave, that can mean the ocean, or that can mean the keen, ochon, or can mean something else. And when you tell me that's also a location that Wales, I revel in that. You know, in the old days, academia, and probably still academia does this, they want to find one definition and they want to stop it at that. The beautiful thing about Gaelic or Celtic or Irish studies is it's always yes and. There's always other solutions. And that is so frustrating for academics, and yet it's so beautiful for those of us who just want to immerse ourselves in it. And just one final thing, to give honor to the OPW. So during the boom years, you know, they would have opened up the nearest cairn to me, Lough Crew, just 12 miles up the road in outside Old Castle. Which again, your website has done amazing work about really documenting some untold stories about it, and the whole issue of Ulla Fola and the misunderstandings that arose around that. But anyway, when the OPW put their guides onto it, and you know, sometimes we can be a bit critical of how the OPW can be over controlling and over limiting and fence people in, and sort of can sometimes over interpret. But at their best, they give people such freedom to imagination. And the guides in Lough Crew would always have people from all over the world coming to Lough Crew. And again, I moved here to Westmeath 20 years ago. Nobody knew about Lough Crew. Nobody. I had no word of it. But it was the crusties who were coming to the Glen of the Downs to fight against the road protests. This was in 96 and 97. English people I'd meet, and they'd say, you know, we've come to Ireland to go to Lough Crew. So we had no idea about them. There was the only place they'd come to in Ireland. Anyway, the OPW, we get a boom year. We get the boom in 2006, and they put people up there, guides up there. And the guides, all they do to tell people, I'm going to now tell you the official lines from the 19th and early 1920s and the 1940s. It's up to you to feel and imagine into it. They'll give you the information, then let you do the greater work. And that's what all of us need to do. And that's what's so key about your website, because you're putting the basic facts we know there, and then you're putting some suppositions and some different ideas. And then it's for all of us to feel into it. And academics will not feel comfortable with that. But the only way we are going to root ourselves in this country again and take back control of who we are from the power we would have given away to everything, no one's to blame, is by feeling into these sites again, by feeling into language, and just asking ourselves what role we want them to play in our lives.
Yeah, that's very interesting. The great writer and philosopher John Moriarty said that the nature of your relationship with the land of Ireland entirely depended on the way that you arrived here. And of course, he invoked our friend Amergin, who is a bit of a hero of mine because he's supposed to be buried locally here in Drogheda. So I have great reverence for him. But Amergin, I think, did something that you're just tapping into right there, which was as the poet, as the bard, as the spiritual figurehead, rather than like the military leaders like Dunn and Eramond would have come looking for blood. Amergin was the one who negotiated with the three goddesses, Ban, Bafola, and Eru, you know, and he was the one that was successful in that negotiation. And I think that's because he met them to an extent on their terms as a sort of a Renaissance figure, as it were, an individual who was totally in touch with not just the depths of his own nature and the depths of human nature, but the depths of the natural world, summoning showers of salmon and all of this stuff when he arrived. It's got a magical touch that I think you're right, that I think certain of the academics, not to pour scorn on them because many of them are my friends, but certain of them certainly won't have that sort of appreciation for. We have to, I think, reintroduce a sense of mysticism into our exploration of the language and the landscape, because it is entirely imbued with that, I think, from the get-go. I've only asked you one question that's on the sheet. If it's okay with you, Manchán, we'll be here till midnight. Is that all right?
Perfect.
Anyway, I will move on just slightly. Okay, I'm going to skip a couple of questions because I just really want to get to I may have questions from the viewers, and it's important that we ask those. One thing I wanted to ask you about.
Can I say one thing? Sorry, I know you have questions, but with regard to, so I am not saying that we need to totally, no, everything we know is based on the academics and researchers. They are the ground on which we walk. And we've all been in mystical sites where you have met people just going far too up their own backsides. So there's a beautiful balance between feeling into things and yet keeping one foot in reality. And it's about doing both of those things at the same time.
Yeah, I entirely agree with you that we shouldn't disparage the academics. My work entirely depends on theirs. I constantly feel as if I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. By the way, among those would be the O'Rahillys, the likes of Whitley Stokes, John O'Donovan, Petrie, the list goes on and on and on, Kuhnemeyer, Rudolf Torneisen, etc., etc. These are people who were giants. And as you say about the O'Rahillys, they were clearly people of great intellect. But I do think that it requires somebody like Moriarty, and I think someone like yourself, to take it beyond that simple sort of expository, narrative that we've had about language and landscape, and to sort of bring a sense of that, that otherworld dimension that is so present and so ready to be spoken about and ready to make itself known. I'm thinking that we should just abandon the questions and just keep chatting because it's so productive. I mean, it's incredible. I actually just going to throw away some of these questions now because I just feel that we've actually had a far more interesting conversation because we haven't stifled it at all. One of the things that I wanted to talk about was the musicality of the language. This is going to require me just to open a Zoom tab or a Chrome tab here for a moment. I hope you don't mind this. So, and perhaps this is something you'd comment on, Manchán, because it's clear from the book, there's a musicality in Irish language that perhaps isn't necessarily present in other languages. And we also see that in dialects. We hear it, for instance, we had Eddie last week, and, I think that those southerly, I think the Kerry and Cork, I think when people from Kerry and Cork speak, it's like they're singing. It's not like they're talking at all. They're not monotonous. They have a wonderful sort of range. It's almost like when you listen to a good storyteller in Ireland, it's like listening to the equivalent of the linguistic equivalent of Freddie Mercury. So just one word, for example. I hope I can get this to work now and that this isn't going to be embarrassing. I think it's pronounced Tuiha. And I just put my speakers up here. So just to give the watchers and the viewers, and especially those perhaps who are not familiar with the language, there are three distinct dialects in Ireland. There's Ulster, there's Connacht, and there's Munster. And there's an incredible difference in the way that words are pronounced. So, for instance, Monaghan in DNA Caillte, which we're going to talk about, you say on so for here. I would say on sho. That's the way I learned it. And to hear you saying on so is not at all grating. It's fascinating. So here are the three versions. Sorry, I hope you can hear these. Here are the three versions of tuiha.
Tuiche.
Tuiha.
Tuhe.
It's like three completely different words.
Tuiche.
Tuiha.
Tuhe.
Or my name, like my name, I say Monaghan because in West Kerry you'd say Monaghan, but in Donegal you'd say Monaghan. As you know, I can start the Monaghan and then Monaghan, and then in Connemara you're not going to put a, you're not going to have that a between the ch. It's just a Kerry thing. In Connemara you'd say Monaghan. What did I say? Yeah, Monaghan. So yeah, everything is changed differently. Like the word, like the, you know, the untach is, or intach is the word for brilliant, and in Connemara but in Kerry it's untach, and there's almost no connection untach and intach. But it's what happens when E.S. Chin Evans, the great anthropologist, was so fascinating, saying that because Ireland is that teddy bear shape, because it's this series of peninsulas, everybody was out on the edge of one peninsula, and they weren't going back down the edge of the peninsula and talking to the people around the next peninsula. So everyone developed their own language, their own sort of version. And E.S. Chin Evans says that's the reason why Welsh was a lot stronger than Irish, because Welsh was spoken in the valleys. And the great thing about the valleys is people can go from one valley to another. They are not isolated. But because Western Scotland and the west of Ireland, each language is spoken in west of Scotland on different islands. In Ireland, either peninsulas or islands, we had this huge difference. And, you know, there's now linguists are doing amazing research to realize how deep it goes when we hear our own dialect. And in fact, I did a TV program back in 2007 called No Berla, and we got people to listen to an hour or half an hour of dialect that wasn't their own. So in Connemara, we got people to listen to Selo Yas, the 12 program, and then people in Kerry had to listen to Donegal, had to listen to Rola McAvey. And we got them to listen for 30 minutes, and we gave them an IQ test at the beginning and an IQ test at the end. And their IQ dropped massively. In the same ways that if you had to listen to French for half an hour and then try and speak a little bit of French, your mind would just be exhausted from the concentration. So for me, it's natural to listen to West Kerry Irish. That is in the same way, it's the same instinct as when a bird hears other birds call. Like, you know, again, research has been done about if you put a fawn among a whole herd of deer, or you put a baby seal among an entire beach full of whining seals, they will be able to spot their mother directly. Even the same with a lamb and a sheep in a field of sheep. We resonate deeply with our mother tongue. Animals do it, birds do it, humans do it. And so that's what's so vital. That's why when I made that program, No Berla in 2007, when I tried to speak Irish with people, I got such a range of emotions. It was all done with hidden cameras. So we went back to the edit suite later and we looked into their eyes. So you could look it into the camera in the edit suite. And you could see this mix of shame, of regret, of fear, of anger, of humiliation. Languages they bypass the brain. They bypass the rational brain. They go deep into the psychological mind. And we know that we've had this language for thousands of years. You know, how many thousands? At least 2,000 years, possibly 3,000, maybe just 2,500 years. And maybe there are words in this language that are connected to the words that were first spoken when the first settlers arrived here 10,000 years ago. As the ice sheet was retreating up to Scotland and up to the North Pole, the first people, you know, realized they could make it onto this island, and they brought a language with them. We'll probably touch on it, but we are not directly descended to those. But maybe some of their words could have gone from generation to generation down. And so that's what this key is into this language. And it's so specific, as you say, that not only will each province have its own, but each region, each island, each peninsula will have its own Irish. And we feel this call at this visceral, at this almost epigenetic level. And that's why these things are deep. And that's why my book has totally irrationally gone into its 5th publication. Nobody needs a book about the Irish language this year. They wouldn't have bought it last year, but something you just feel, wait there, I want to know something about myself. And this year it's my book, but next year it's going to be different TV series, it's going to be websites, it's going to be part of this grand awakening.
I can tell you now exactly, Manchán, I can tell you exactly what's going on. I think I can anyway. And this is my own view. I think that in your book, and I was going to say that I think that you might just have single-handedly, or at least contributed to the salvation of the language from extinction. And that's because a great deal of the problem, and one of the reasons that I regrettably didn't have the interest in the language as a young adult, was because I felt that it had been drummed into me. And I think what you've done with the book is you've given us that connection that the school teachers, God love them, and no fault against them, because a lot of the school teachers that I had were fantastic people, wonderful people. But they didn't express that connection. For them, it was an exercise in learning. And it was all about conjugating verbs and learning words for things. It wasn't about, first of all, the lyricism and the musicality of the language, but then capturing that connection to part of the problem. I believe if you look at, for instance, the school's folklore, you'll see that a lot of the schools on the Western Seaboard, they wrote everything as Gaeilge. The schools on the Eastern Seaboard, in Drogheda and elsewhere, and Dublin, mostly wrote as Béarla in English. So even a century ago, we seem to have lost the interest and lost that connection. And I think the reason your book has struck a chord with people is precisely because you have, in essence, peeled back this layer, taken back this skim, that word that I didn't even know. We used to say a skim of butter, and I used to think that was an English word. SCIM is from Irish, a skim, a thin covering. You've peeled back that skim. You've peeled back the curtain that conceals that other world. And that other world, I think, is very much present in the language and the linguistic expression of the people. And I believe that that's precisely why it's on its 5th printing. And I believe that we'll go a lot further than that, if you don't mind me saying.
Thank you. And do you remember, do you remember the other definitions of skim as well, as you said? Well, you touched on them. So skim, as you say, it can be a thin spread of butter, or of dust on a mantelpiece, or of whitewash on a wall. But then skim also can mean a supernatural covering that covers the land in the early morning. And it can also mean succumbing to the supernatural world through sleep. So to have one word that can go onto so many dimensions, and for a modern rational person who wants to box things in, that's infuriating. But for someone who really wants to dive into concepts and dreams, almost like a sort of psychedelic trip each word is, then it becomes gorgeous.
Well, this is exactly what I meant when I said that the Dineen Folklore was such an eye-opener for me. It wasn't like a dictionary, it was like an exploration, you know. So I'll ask one more question, then I'm going to get on to some questions provided by the viewers. Now, if we have time, just to let everyone who's watching know, if we have time at the end, we will allow a couple of open mic questions from the audience, if you have them. So maybe if you have a question, but just make sure that you pay attention to the questions that are asked, because we don't want to repeat anything. My last question, Manchán, was, and it actually pertains to what we've just been talking about, I think. Do you think that the introduction of air codes, and for our international viewers, there are zip codes or postcodes in Ireland in recent years, will hasten the demise of old place names in some areas? And if so, is there anything we can do to counteract that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't know. What I do see is that, again, you know, this year, in the last few years, Mehel Luganum. So luganum.ie is this great website. And, you know, the last chapter of my book gives all the sources I use. So genuinely, I am not in any way, I don't have great intelligence or research. I'm a good journalist. So I made this book by using the resources in the last chapter. And that is Dineen, as you said, to a good degree, the schools collection that you've already referred to, luganum.ie, this database that the government has of all the place names in Ireland, and a few other dictionaries. They're all named there. And but one wonderful thing this year Loganum did was mehalloganum.ie, you know, where they've asking the public now. Loganum.ie, the great experts will come up with the official title and the reasons for a title for the place names, but then they're asking all of us to ask our older people in the community for the names of the fields, the names of the back roads, the names of the hills, the names of the rocks, and to input them on this website. And there is such interest in this. First, that same group based in DCU, Chanter, is getting everyone, you know, to type out all of the school's collection, the folklore from the 1930s, and a huge amount of people are doing it at night. Likewise, all of us, this crowd grouping coming together to do things, a bit like Wikipedia. We are all contributing this knowledge of mapping townlands and villages and sort of rocks and fields that were never known about in a grander scale. So I see computers and digitization and the likes of Aircode actually helping us find this information. Now, that would have been irrelevant had people not been curious, but you cannot say people have not been curious. The last, as I said, 5 years has shown this absolute resurgence in an interest in our culture. And I said it's so easy. So all of last year, I spent on a project called Sea Tamagotchi, collecting up the sea words, the coastal words. And this was probably the first bit of actually primary research I've almost ever done, unless it was for a TV or radio series. I went around the west coast of Ireland to Donegal, to Galway, to Mayo. And first I'd ask around for people, who is the fisherman I should speak to? And everyone knows in their area, who is the farmer, who is the local woman who is always interested in folklore. So I've found them, and it's very easy to find them. As you know, you just think within your own community, who is the older person or even the young person? Like the great man in Mayo, Fiachra McGowan, who just had so much knowledge, a young man who died tragically early. But there's always one person with all the knowledge. I would just go to the fisherman, and the richness in the words I found, words that aren't in Dineen's dictionary, words that were only in this tiny coastal area for really remote things. And what I'm doing with those words now is every day I put them up on my Instagram, which is the Manchán Magan Instagram, and I put them up on Twitter. And I've come up with this little book, which is like Sea Tamagotchi. That's not very clear, but a little book, little handmade book that was made in Mayo of some of the words. I'll open one. Oignas and Chladig, that was collected from Mayo, from Pat Murphy in Mayo. The sense of loneliness on the shore, a haunting presence of people who lived and died long ago. Anyway, the words are still there. It just requires us to go out and get them. And that would have been no good, because we would have just put them on a little white file card, like we would have, if this was 20 years ago, 30 years ago even. Now we can, thanks to the likes of that type of air code and digitization, we can now put these up on the internet and share them with the world. And one final thing I want to say, although I focus quite a lot on the Irish language in this book, and you and your website, you're focusing on Irish archaeological sites. Really what we're both tapping in on is that this is a global thing. This is an international thing. You could just as easily be looking at a landscape, anywhere in the world, in Syria, in Malta. I could be looking at a coastal area in any place, getting words from a coastal area. These are international things that we are doing. But what's wonderful, we in Ireland are playing our little part. And then once we've collected this knowledge in Ireland, then we interlink and make it a global thing. And the only way any of us is going to move forward in the world is if we take these local stories, really inhabit them, be proud of them, and then reach out and make it a global thing and connect.
Yeah. So in effect, what's actually happened, you're right, is that there's a natural counteraction has already occurred, because the danger at the moment is my address, for instance, is A92, XYXY. So you actually only need to put Anthony Murphy, A92XY, whatever, and that will get to me. The danger is that you lose the townland names, you lose the street names. But I think you're right, because you've when, for instance, the field names projects. I mean, we've had brilliant field names projects in Louth and in Meath. I believe in Meath, the total number of field names collected was something like 24,000. And that, of course, as well as being a rich collection, is also a sort of a museum of sorts to make sure that these things don't get utterly lost. I do have a couple of questions about Sea Tamagotchi that we'll get to, by the way. So the first of the questions from viewers is from Paul Gowran. Paul is one of our very regular viewers. And he asks, if the English language hadn't been forced upon us, would you think this richness would prevail today? Or is modernization of the language likely to have done similar harm in any case?
Oh, great idea. Yeah. So, like, the big thing I make the argument for in the book is that the idea of the other world and the divine consciousness is in the language, in things like I talk about Clean's wave and how people might still use it for a bad storm in West Cork, but then it brings up the idea of supernatural waves. And possibly a lot of that would have been washed out of it. You know, the terms might still be there, but the belief, one way or the other, I suppose we were going to turn our back on that magical at some point. The magic, the miracle is that we kept up with that almost pagan animistic belief system for so long after we adopted Christianity. Like how the hell we managed to keep all this alive until the 20th century is just a work of, it's a work of genius and a work of miracle. But we probably would have watered that down. In the same way as, like, when you were talking about the addresses, yes, we had the addresses until whatever, 5 years ago, but we had ignored the potency of those addresses. I certainly had. The last few months I've been writing out a lot of addresses, posting my book to people. And as you say, I hadn't read the richness of townlands. Like, you would swear that each of these townlands I'm writing out were made up. They're the most beautiful things. And because I suppose I was brought up in Dublin, where there's less evocative, you could argue that. We still have some lovely Stillorgan, Leopardstown and things, but maybe there's some less evocative place names. But we've had the place names, but in the 70s and 80s and 90s, I think we just turned our brain off to quite how rich and evocative they were. And yet we probably would have done the same with the Irish language. We would have modernized it and lost some of the beauty. Because again, although I'm making the case for the Irish language, you can make the same case for any ancient language. It just happens that most of the European languages aren't ancient. But if you're speaking Arabic, if you're speaking Hebrew, you still have all of those multi-layers that come when one people are speaking the same language for millennia.
I would say there's a question actually that pertains to all this from Marina Maroney, but just before I get to it, because this ties in very nicely with it. So here in Drogheda, for instance, my townland is Rathmullen. And of course, everybody will be familiar with Rathmullen because it's a very famous Rathmullen in Donegal. This is a different Rathmullen. I reckon it's related to a ring fort up the road here, the ring fort of Mullen. Another is Leg of Oreen, which is Lag of Ohrin, which I think is the hollow. Is it the hollow of the little road? Another is Yellow Batter, which is very interesting because it's like a fusion of English and Irish. Because in Irish it properly should be Boher Boy, the yellow road. Yellow Batter, batter being some sort of a crude anglicisation of Boher. But the most interesting one, in my opinion, is a townland just across the Boyne here on the north side of Drogheda called Moneymore, which basically means the big bog. But there's a story recorded in the Louth Ordnance Survey letters that suggests that the bog is the remains of, the bog covers the remains of a city that was once there a long time ago and that was drowned in a great cataclysmic flood. And I just thought that's the most extraordinary thing I'd ever. I mean, I've seen a lot. Drogheda has a huge amount of history. I see Una Sheehan is watching. Una is a historian from Drogheda. A lot of people will know Drogheda has a huge multi-layered history. We've Cromwell, we've got Normans, we've got, we've always been a port town. We had the Battle of the Boyne on our doorstep, all of this stuff. And the most incredible thing I think I've ever read about Drogheda was that there was supposedly, according to legend, a lost city buried beneath the bog that was once Moneymore. The wonderful thing about the local authorities is that they preserve these place names. We have a housing estate in my townland called Rathmullen. There's a housing estate in Moneymore called Moneymore. And there's a housing estate in Yellow Batter called Yellow Batter. But Marina's question is very interesting. Can I ask Manchán if it is possible, I think she's asking you personally to do this, to put a stop to the generation of random place names for building developments or street names that have awful names that seem to be chosen because they sound pretty in English, but are meaningless and not rooted in anything to do with the place. I know that place names evolve in the same way as language evolves. Even the anglicisation of place names bore some relationship to the original place name. But naming a housing estate something like Sunnymead makes no sense. I think it erodes our culture, and I hate it with a passion. I don't see why we can't do this in Ireland. So I'm not sure if she's expecting you to be an ambassador for this, or is there something do you think that we can do collectively?
I mean, I think there is. I think so. As you say, for the moment, most people had switched off to those things, to the importance of our heritage and keeping what's unique about the Irish culture, the Irish unbroken lineage alive. But what we saw is that there's some places that they didn't happen in. And Iceland is the great example. Iceland, where everyone is fluent in English, is absolutely in the modern world, but are so proud of their language, of their culture, of the stories, of their knitwear. You know, their ridiculously warm jumpers. No, we had this sense of post-colonial shame and guilt about our past, and we won't get into it here. So we weren't proud of who we were. And then, as you said, the Irish and then Irish culture and history was taught badly in school, or was taught in a way that didn't engage us. All of that was going to happen as long as we were poor. And so, although people bemoan that the first boom, where in the 90s, where everything. Where we got T.G. Carr and we got other things. That boom was really important. For the first time, Irish people realized, actually, we're not always going to be poor. And of course, we did bad things with the money, people always do with their first time around. But it made us realize, actually, we can be confident. And now, as we see that we have this presence on the world stage, we're not laughed at, we are beginning to get a confidence in ourselves. And as part of this, we are going back to our culture, going back to our language. It all takes time, but once we do that, realize that we don't have that post-colonial guilt, or the famine guilt, we don't have the shame of being poor, we can take on our own culture. And then, as you say, once the language and heritage are taught and presented to us in an acceptable way, we'll have a natural pride, and we will naturally want to call our townlands and our housing estates words that resonate with us. It was only because of entirely understandable reasons that link with our culture was broken. We had to break it. Our grandparents, our great-grandparents had to stop us speaking Irish to force us to teach English so we could go to England and America and survive. It was a tragedy, but it was an inevitability. And it has led to a lot of loss, but it's not too late. As I just said with Sea Tamagotchi, you go along the coastline of the west coast of Ireland and you find the words are still there. People still have the knowledge. It just requires our generation to act very quickly to gather up this knowledge and to present it to people in a way that they want to do more with it.
And perhaps we should be sort of proactively reaching out to our local politicians and councillors and saying to them, look, here's a list of possible names for new developments in the area, rather than giving them these bland, anglicised names. Nora Gaffney O'Connor says, reading the book, 32 words for field, I noticed on kayak mentioned so much throughout. And she wants to know, was Manchán surprised how much she has featured through the words in so many different areas?
I was, yeah, like I didn't intend for it to take up so many. I think this is like 3 or 4 chapters, maybe more of book, and there could have been a lot more on the Caillte. What's interesting is the minute you look at anything about our past, you're getting into female energy. And of course, that was one thing that, a lot of the academics wouldn't, in the 19th century, wouldn't have been too comfortable, and particularly the clerics in the 18th, 17th, 16th, 15th century would not have wished for this attention to go on female energy. And if this second book, so I just said, I wrote one book in December, January, and for children, a book of Irish words for children. And now at the moment, I'm writing a book on landscape. But no matter what angle I look at landscape, you are ending up with female energy. I'm trying not to mention the Caillte because she features so much in the first book, but there are goddesses everywhere, as women have realized forever. So yeah, everything about our past is to do with female energy, with women, with cycles, with nature, with the goddess. There's almost, I had to cut out so many references where the Caillte would have naturally fitted in that book, just because it was going to become a book about the Caillte. And then, the Caillte because all those goddesses intertwined with each other, there's almost no end to it. It's all this complex interwoven female energy in balance with the male, but led by nature, the feminine, the earth, and then in balance. Yeah, and that's another way we need to find a way of talking about all these things. Ideally, not a man should be talking about it. And as I mentioned in the book, I have 40 different words for the male sexual organ. There's very few words yet have been collected for the female. They're all out there, but people haven't collected them, mainly because the folklorists from UCD in the 1940s, Seamus Delargy and all, weren't really going and asking women for all the words for their gender and sexuality. That
Yeah.
all remains to be done. And again, I hear there are some academics doing it, some women academics doing it currently, which is great.
Very good. The links between Irish, Arabic, and India through words was fascinating, says Nora, especially pointed out by the Brahmin he met on the Himalayan mountain. Would it be true to say, she wonders, that we all came from the same spiritual belief?
Yes, yes. So I think I mentioned the idea that what would have happened, and it's probably a lot of renowned either archaeologists and anthropologists would agree that the culture, and even the DNA proves it, the culture seems to have been set up. Our culture, our DNA lineage comes from either the Russian steppes or the Middle East. It's sort of a middle place, and then it went east to India and west to Ireland. And there was the same sort of, we know there was a basic Indo-European language. There was also sort of an animistic deus, nature-based belief system. And it would have radiated out to the edges, just like a stone dropped in the middle of a pond radiates out. And so where is it left? It's left in the outer circle, the outer regions of the circle, having dropped into the center. So you find it in West Kerry, you find it in Brittany, you find it in Scotland, and you also find it in the Far East, in India too. And it is all this notion of that there being a God of all things, that there being a God, animated life force, a spirit force animating everything. And it's going back to what spiritualists are now saying, that the fact that this divine energy, this sort of energy seems to be within every object, within the DNA of every cell of every being. It seems to be connecting that idea that while we had a few centuries, a few millennia believing that God was a male figure on a throne, resplendent in white with a long white beard, we might be beginning to access a more complicated and multi-nuanced and multi-layered and multi-dimensional take on divinity, on a divine.
Yeah. It was interesting in that regard, in connection with India, you drew attention to Govinda and the similarity with Boeing or Buvinda. That it essentially means the same thing, the white cow or the sacred cow. And I think you pointed out that, on the periphery of this great Indo-European mass, that there are vestiges of possibly an ancient common language on that periphery.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not possibly, it's an Indo-European language. We know we share the same roots with that language. I mean, the links with Arabic are more tangential. They're just perhaps coincidences or perhaps interesting. I mean, we know there would have been connections between Ireland and the Arabic world. How profound they would have been, we don't know. But we know like that papyrus sheets have been found on a book in a bog in Offaly. We know that the Barbary monkey found up in Navan Fort, there were this trade. We know that the Arabs obviously had a strong presence in Spain, and there were Spanish sailors coming up. So there was that interlink between us and the Arab world. But like the roots, the connection that Miles Dillon first found between Irish mythology and Indian mythology, Irish and Indian rules, laws, Irish mindset and Irish language and Irish and Indian, it's just so strong, so potent, because as you said, they were at one time part of a unified culture that then disseminated.
It's interesting in that regard, and just something that I thought of, that in one of the well-known stories connected with Newgrange, Altram Chiagavether, the fosterage of the house of the two meters or drinking vessels, there is a mention of two sacred cows that I believe were brought from India by Manannán. Now, it could be wrong about the specific detail, but there certainly were at least one, I think, two cows, and I think they had been brought from India. I must actually go back over that again, because you just suddenly, I was reading that only in the past couple of days, the Govinda.
That's on your website, isn't it, that story?
I think it is, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you knew that. No, you didn't. Liam Smith on Facebook wants to know if you still have, now of course this is all contingent on COVID-19, but can you ask Manchán if he still has a love for travel, or does he feel like he's done it all?
Yeah, I mean, I did a lot of travel in those years of going to India, South America and Africa, and then making all these TGCAR programs from 96 until I suppose about 2004 with my brother. I would have done a lot. I did last year, in January or February 2020, I announced that I was giving up flying, that as a travel writer, I felt because of climate change, it wasn't natural. It wasn't right for me to be promoting travel by flights. So I said I wouldn't do that. I said I would still fly for a business if I had to do a trip, a lecture tour, if I felt it was, valid. But I wouldn't fly for travel again, for travel anymore. Sorry, for holidays anymore. So it's sort of easy for me to say that, as people said, because I've done so much travel in the past, and I'm definitely not telling people not to fly. I'm just saying, for me, as a travel writer, it was right for me to stop flying. So yeah, I don't feel a strong urge to see anywhere else in the world. There's lots of places I've never been. I've never been to Japan. I've never been to Russia. Never been to Australia or New Zealand. But no, I got to see a lot.
Yeah. Andrew Main via email is asking questions that kind of stray more into the sort of DNA Caillte field of things. He's looking for an opinion that's probably more suited to ask an archaeologist, but I'll ask it anyway. When originally built, what do you think the megalithic tombs like Douth or Newgrange looked like? Would they have been covered over with grass as now, or were they naked rock? And the grass is a product or a byproduct of abandonment. Was Brunabonia all a linked kind of necropolis, perhaps? Similarly, were the portal dolmens originally covered over? A very archaeological question. I'm not sure if you have the expertise or the inclination to answer.
You would. You've read enough papers that you know exactly how to answer that question. But that is a good example of this, how we rely so much on the experts for this, and how it's important to say, isn't it, that there is a danger for us to feel into the answers too much, and that is definitely not what I am advocating. I'm saying that we need to familiarize ourselves with all of the knowledge, with all of the facts, and then perhaps allow an element of feeling. But no, for that I would bow to the current expertise, but being aware that that is changing the whole time, and that we don't need to take the current expertise as absolutely black and white fact, but we need to put suppositions on it.
By the way, it's very interesting in regard to that question, because in mythology, and I always think people think mythology is just made up stories. In the aforementioned Altron Chiagov Ether, there's a mention of Manannán making a circuit of the principal monuments, right? And in advance of his visit to Newgrange, what are they doing? They're carefully placing rushes. I think it's lochar. They're carefully placing rushes over the monument. They're decorating it in advance of his visit. And I wonder, is that somehow a dim memory of something that was done back then when, as Andrew points out, maybe it was just the bare rocks were exposed, but on special occasions they decorated it with rushes. Who knows?
Yeah. And don't you, whenever you're in one of those sites, don't you always try and picture what would have been the wooden elements that would have clad these that have probably now disappeared? And I know in some instances, like in Navan Fort, or like in the ring circle at Brough, what is it called, the Lochgur, where you can still see the element, the remains of the rock, of the stone posts, of the wooden posts in the ground. But there could potentially have so much scaffolding covering these, and beautiful decorative pieces which have rotten and wouldn't have survived by being wood. So we have the liberty to imagine all of those too, with knowing it's unlikely we will ever have proof of that.
Yeah, we'll never. Laura Monaghan, who refers to herself as that Laura Monaghan, she had a discourse with you previously via email, says, I found both 32 Words for Field and C. Tamagotchi beautifully magical books which invoked a profound sense of loss for something I never even knew I missed. So, at the risk of sounding greedy, and you've already answered the question, but perhaps you'll tell us a little bit about the deadlines and when it will be available. I was just wondering if you have any plans to expand upon Irish words for theme in future books, or indeed what you're working on at the moment, which somebody else has asked.
Yeah, so Lorna is one of these wonderful people who started swimming a lot in this area in the Midland Lakes. So what?
It's Lorna, isn't it?
Lorna.
Did I say Laura? I apologize, Lorna.
No, and I might be wrong, but I think that's who it is. What was I going to say? Yeah, so yeah, I do. I mean, as I said, the final chapter of my book, I put all my sources there because I believe there is a million ways one can expand on what I've done in this book. There is so many riches, like to do with it. There's a great book about, female sexuality. There's a great book to be written about herbal knowledge and even the knowledge of mushrooms. And there's a great book to be written about constellations and stars. And in fact, the great Radio na Gaeltachta and RT presenter, nephew of Danny Sheehy, Sean McAteague, I think is working on a book about the Irish words for constellations are to do with cows and things. So all of us, there's so much work to be done. I intend, this year I was looking at coastal words. That was last year. This year I'm writing about landscape. I'm doing this children's book of Irish words. I suppose the children's book might be out for next Christmas. Hopefully I have more time before the landscape book needs to come out. But what we need is all of the knowledge is now there. It's all online. All of the folk tales that you refer to and so many more, as you know, they're all down the UCC website. They're all available from our seat in the evening time. So all of us can start doing this work and putting the information out there in an as engaging way as we can. And so that's what's great about Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. We can, just like, the Irish Four, that great Twitter website did, or the Twitter feed of Dineen, who poses different words from Dineen, we can start sharing all this information, and then people can do new things with it. Like the Welsh have been making amazing movies and, pop songs and rock groups with their lore, we need to do the same. So it's about, like, I have, as I said, I have no great academic or knowledge or wisdom. I haven't studied anything. I'm just like a journalist. I know how to amass the facts in an engaging way. And because so many, and only in writing, so many more people a lot younger than me are so much better at doing it digitally, or doing it in the internet. Like my Instagram page, there's this great woman in Sligo, Lauren Varian, who does it, because I can't even do that. So there are so many people who will be able to take all this information and do far greater things with it, so that we can then put it among all of us, so that it then becomes teaching resources. So then it's natural for the Department of Education to take all of these things on board and present the language in a way that is about us being absolutely proud of who we are, of these mad-capped warrior, heroic female-led visionaries. And with that, it'll be natural for us to take it on board. We'll want to. We won't have to have it beaten into us. We will be proud. We will be proud ambassadors of an Indigenous culture who will then go out into the world and resource and support and recognize other cultures around the world who are going back and finding their land-based traditional culture. And that's a new way of uniting, I think.
Brilliant, yeah. So it'll be hopefully a real community effort. And one that, my confession is the same as yours, Manchán. I'm not academically trained. I have a leaving certificate. That's the height of my qualifications. I'm also a journalist, somebody who's used to marshalling facts and putting them together in an interesting way. So the point is that the ordinary folk, as it were, the ordinary citizens, can make a contribution to this, because as we saw with the folklore collection, that the school children went off and spoke to their grandparents and their granduncles and grandaunts and collected the stories from there. You don't have to be academically trained in early Irish to deal with this stuff. You can still make an active and, of course, a valid contribution to the whole thing. Amy Coe on email says that she caught your interview on Tommy Tiernan, and that you mentioned Queen Maeve on the rite of passage for warriors to be sent into the cave of the cats after ingesting mushrooms. She's wondering where you got the information from, because Amy is currently looking into Irish lore and would love to know the source for that.
Yeah, so it was Tommy who mentioned it was Queen Maeve, and it was Tommy who mentioned magic mushrooms. I mentioned Uibh Nagat, or as I said incorrectly, Uibh Nagat. So Uibh Nagat, is in Tulsk, County Roscommon, and it is the best source of information to that is to go to Tulsk in County Roscommon on the main road from Longford to Mayo, on the main road to Mayo from the East Coast. And you go to Tulsk, and there you'll see the Rathmullen Visitors Centre. And it is this visionary centre. So, there's a lot of very good Fáilte Ireland and OPW centres, but what is unique about Rathmullen is it's the local community came together and set up this visitor centre. And my God, the passion of the guides there and the knowledge of the guides. And they have come up with a guidebook, a most beautiful animated guidebook of the knowledge. And they have done deep research on every reference to Uibh Nagat and to Rathmullen down through the ages and presented it in a really eloquent way. So they, in their research, have certainly not found any, proof that people were taking mushrooms and going down that hole. But what we do know is it was often referred to as a ritual chamber of transformation. It was a place where men went on a ritual. That's the case, but yet I have been searching it for many years, hearing it was the sacred cave of divine energy, of the Morrigan, of a sort of a female power energy. And So both elements are true. But when you have Queen Maeve, which is the mythic goddess, and then when you have anyone talking about female energy, and even the Morrigan, you see these could easily equate. It's basically female energy because it's a womb, it's a hole in the ground, it's the female womb, and then it's likely that a man goes into the female womb because that was how the yin and yang of things happened, and then that man tested himself. There are accounts of stories, and that was why it's called Uiv Nagat and Uiv Nagat, because there was these wild cats down there, Nagat, but then Uiv Nagat was also where you battled with the cats. So it could have been the cave of the cats or the cave of the fighting. But it is definitely worth going down. But you're never going to find the hole on your own. You need to go to Rathmullen Visitor Centre and ask them, and they will bring you down. And my God, the knowledge they will give you on your way. It's a profound experience. It's up there with Skellig.
Yeah, I think there's been a suggestion too among some of the guides at Brunabonia that, you know, psilocybin might have been ingested as a means to access these visions or hallucinations or otherworld dreams, as it were. It's all speculative, and I know that until such time as we find residue in a Neolithic pot, and there's possibly one or two archaeologists watching who may be able to direct us towards sources on that, we might not be able to say for sure. Manchán, tell us a little bit for a minute. Let's talk about, because I'm conscious of the fact that time is ticking. We haven't discussed DNA Caillte. As you know, because we were chatting before we came into the room, we in the Mythical Ireland community, we were very excited by the program and of course by the revelations. What was it like to be sort of at the center of that in terms of presenting it to the world?
So DNA Caillte, it's a TGR series, a 3-part TGR series that's still available for free on the TGR website, as far as I know. I'm pretty sure of that. I know I did a 12-part series on trees, or maybe a 18-part series on trees, Crean Hair, and that's up there. I think DNA Caillte is still up there. And it was an idea I had a few years ago. Someone told me that there was heads found on the railings. There were skulls on the railings in the 17th century, I think, on the railings of Dublin Castle.
Oh, the Elizabethan era, yes, that's what they used to do. Yeah.
And someone told me that those skulls were still in a lab down in UCC. And that if I just thought, and they said, if you could find those skulls and if you could DNA test them, you could probably find out, who these people are, their descendants today. So I was fascinated by that. So I brought the idea to a production company, and that was about a decade ago. The reason I don't make TV, it just takes so long. It's so hard to try and get funding. So mostly I don't have the patience. But eventually we got commissioned for this DNA Caillte series, and production, then Tile Films took away all the research, and realized that even from the time I first had the idea to now, there has been so many breakthroughs done in the field of DNA, basically through the work of Professor Dan Bradley and Laura Cassidy in Trinity College. But they're building on what's happening internationally. And internationally, like, they're now finding chewing gum from sort of a woman in Denmark from like 6,000 years ago. And from that, they're realizing they're finding DNA traces of her viruses, DNA traces of the duck and the hazelnut she had ate, as well as full DNA traces of herself to be able to recreate her hair coloring, her eyes, her body, her size and shape. All can be recreated from the vague traces of DNA that would have been in a bit of 6,000-year-old chewing gum. So this world is just going to revolutionize our understanding of the past. And at the moment, it is this small group in Trinity who are doing some research on it. And it just happens that what they're doing is they're going to the old bone collections of the National Museum, and they're trying to find an example of the hardest bone in the body, the petrous gland, which is a bone in the neck, or in the neck?
In the back of the skull, isn't it?
Here, exactly. Behind exactly.
Temporal bones, yeah.
Yeah, and it's the hardest bone in the body. So if they can find that, there's normally DNA. It's pretty easy to extract DNA from that. Well, when I say pretty easy, it then takes a supercomputer to churn through all the different sequences, because when DNA, we have a simple 23 strands of DNA when we're alive. By that stage, it is separated to all sorts of different things. So they need to do supercomputers and find information. And slowly they're beginning to find amazing revelations. So, I talked to the archaeologist who first did the excavation in Powell in the famous dolmen in the Burren in County Clare, and how they were able to then find that one of these children had Down syndrome. So this Neolithic slightly nomadic group of farmers at the time in the Burren still had the care and the compassion and the love to look after this Down syndrome child. And then, as you and your audience was particularly excited about, the first episode where we follow Laura Cassidy as she does research on the remains of bones, of petrous bone that was found in the central chamber of Newgrange. And they find that the bones of the body, which was most likely a royal or a body of high status, this was in the very central stone cairn of the central chamber, so it was most likely a royal figure. And they realized that the DNA of the petrous, of the bones of this body, showed that his parents were either brother and sister or very closely related. And that was a revelation, because that's something we are very familiar with from Egyptian culture, from Pharaohic culture in Egypt, how the leaders, the kings and the queens, would have kept their divine energy within each other, within that tiny sphere of field of who they were, by having sex with each other, and so giving birth to another line of the divine lineage. And the fact that it looks like that might have been done in Ireland too was a revelation. And so it made it very exciting to work on that. We were just reporting on what they were doing. We did absolutely no research. Just the folk, Laura and Dan Bradley, were very kind to let us in on the research they were doing at the time.
Yeah, but it is the most significant revelation about Brú na Bóinne in a generation since O'Kelly and Ogan began their digs at those monuments and began to reveal the nature and the sizes of them and the megalithic art, etc., etc.
And then since your big discovery during the drought of 2 years ago as well, it's
been an interesting couple of years. We were particularly interested also afterwards. Well, I picked up on it, but Lara and Dan et al., all of the people who contributed to that paper, mentioned the myth about doubt. But there were two other myths pertaining to Newgrange relating to incest as well. It seems to have been a theme in mythology. And of course, one could never stake one's reputation, as you know, on saying that, well, this myth must go all the way back to the time of Newgrange. But certainly you'd be inclined, certainly not to be too dismissive of that. Just want to let everyone in on a little thing that I'm working on at the moment. So in the mythology of Newgrange, and this is very interesting, Dagda, who's the solar deity, apparently the chief of the gods, he fancies Bowen and he wants to mate with her. Now, according to a lot of the stories of Newgrange, Bowen is married to Elkmar, but there are variations that say Elkmar is in fact a brother of Bowen. He's very protective of her. He's very jealous of the Dagda's intentions towards her. The Dagda casts a spell on him, makes him go away for what he thinks is going to be 1 day, and it's actually 9 months. They conceive a child, that's Dagda and Bowen. Elkmar comes back, and the Dagda and Bowen abandon Angus, and he's picked up by Midger and brought to Bree to be fostered. But what I found fascinating was this apparent confusion about whether Elkmar was Bowen's husband or brother. And I wonder whether that's a concealment of something about, or if it's a distant fragment of memory about the sort of stuff that was obviously, now we know, was happening at Newgrange in the Neolithic. In other words, that perhaps Bowen and Elkmar were brother and sister and conceived Angus, but there was this huge story about the sun god contrived as a contrivance to perhaps cover up the illicit nature of their union. Anyway, that was more a thought than a question, but if you had any thoughts, Manchán, please, by all means.
No, that's fascinating, very exciting, yeah.
There you go. Just quickly, because I'm just conscious again of time, and I do hope that we can let a couple of live questions in. Movanwe Millward, who's another of our regular viewers, she says that 32 words for Field is a rich adventure that's brightened up the winter evenings for me. How did you go about putting it all together, and how long did it take you?
Yeah, that was the hard bit. That took 6 years. I have been finding these stories, and again, that any of us can find on the internet. They're not hard to find. Interesting, like that story Anthony just told us there. Each of us is tickled by that, and we're thinking, my God, there's so much we can do about it. No, most of us, and probably I, will just forget that. Like, that's a beautiful little insight. And there's so many websites providing these great little hot takes, as Blind Boy might say. But then it's the idea, I've pages and pages of all this. And I thought, how am I going to shape it all together? And that's what did my head in for so long, for like 6 years. I have no book here. There's no way. I need to find it, and then I need to make it so light. I want every chapter to be just 5 or 6 pages long, because I'm tired at night. I don't have the patience for a long book. I need to just try and cut everything excessive out and just leave enough that'll tickle people. And because I'm academic, I don't need to put in the sources and I don't need to prove anything. I just need to suggest things and make sure that they are based on some type of good enough evidence, but to allow people then make their own assumptions.
But I think one of the reasons that your book works very well, Manchán, is because of those short chapters, that you can put it down regularly and pick it up again regularly, you know? And I love the way you weave the threads from one chapter to the next, to the next, to the next. So it's still one sort of sinuous and continuous story. So 6 years, Mavanwe, is the answer there. And could you please pronounce the phrase you use to get rid of dogs and bears? I'd like to try it out on a few Welsh dogs.
Yeah, it was a Bulawaya, Bulawaya, Bulawaya. As I said, I've used it in Peru and in Bolivia, and it works very well there. So bull is obviously hit, and then or bull or go or hit or just get off. Beat is the really word. Beat Awalia home, beat home.
What I think is totally crazy is the fact that there are animals in South America who understand Irish phrases that I don't. 2 more questions. Can I ask Manchán? This is from Emer Regan. Why did you choose the word Tamagotchi for your series, Sea Tamagotchi, collecting words that describe nuances around the sea? I'm curious as to what this word represents.
Yeah, so it's a ridiculous word for Sea Tamagotchi taken out of context. But Sea Tamagotchi is a follow-on from a project I did maybe 6 years ago called Gaeilge Tamagotchi. And Gaeilge Tamagotchi, I'd realized I'd found a dictionary of 4,300 words to describe someone's character. A dictionary published by Cushgame, the publisher. And 4,300 words just to describe someone's character. And most of these words were being forgotten. So I I set up a tent made out of 30 meters of raw Irish linen from Donegal. And I got people to wind their way to the center of the tent, and I would give them a word. And I wanted them to care for the word and mind it. And Tamagotchi was a little digital toy in the 1990s from Japan. It was a little toy, and you had to press buttons to care for it, to milk it, to water it, to change its nappy, and to look after it. And I thought, I will be giving people words, and I want them to foster it and to care for it and to nourish it and nurture it. So I thought it'd be amusing first to mix the 2 languages, the Irish and Japanese words, and then to give people the words. So then that sort of made sense. But then when I decided that Sea Tamagotchi would be a child, an offspring of Gaeilge Tamagotchi, I called it Sea Tamagotchi. But out of context, it's sort of a ridiculous name. But it's too late now.
That's where I knew Tamagotchi from. I knew it was some sort of toy from a generation ago. I didn't realize there was a direct connection. Joe Grandinetti, who writes from Mountaintop in Pennsylvania, and I think we've kind of answered this, but we'll just make this the last of the prepared questions. I know there are efforts to keep the Irish language alive with the younger generation. I'm wondering how the phenomena like the book 32 Words for Field are carrying over in this effort. Do you believe we'll ultimately lose many or most of these descriptive landscape words, as I assume they only live currently in the conversations of the elderly or in fading memories of the middle-aged?
Yeah, so my book is a very, very positive book, but the reality is the book is dependent on not the Irish of the cities, but the Irish of the Gaeltachts, that rich, continuous, unbroken line. And certainly those words in the Gaeltachts are dying. I hear the young people in the Gaeltachts having a different Irish from their parents and their grandparents. Now, it's not too late to change it. You know, we could reverse the ship, but what I do see more likely is possibly urban people taking on the Irish language, and it'll take them a while to build up that richness. So yeah, the likelihood was we might lose a lot of those.
Well, if I can just say that I've been intending to return Táiméag Fólam Gaeilge Irish. It has been my intention to go back to learn Irish. I've been trying to do it over the last while, trying to find time to do it. Your book, Manchán, has spurred me on greatly in that regard. I'm more determined than ever now. At least partly because I write about the Irish language so much, but also because I want to be able to speak it. And I have this great desire to do so. And your book has instilled that in me to an even greater degree. So I just want to say thank you for that. Thank you to all the Mythical Ireland community who sent in questions. If there are, if you don't mind, Manchán, for a few minutes, if there are one or two questions, is there anybody in the room who would like to ask Manchán a question? And let me step out of the way for a minute. Blaheen Nigyolarua there has her hand up.
Hey, I put my question into the comments there. I was just wondering, I was very interested in the first part of DNA Caillte when you went to Rathmullen Island and mentioned, I can't remember if it was Bronze or Iron Age and the Ukrainian connection, and I was hoping you'd come back to it, but you never did. And it's fascinating because I was just wondering, like, do we have Slavic connections? Is there any kind of connection there? Was there anything more done on that? That's all I want to know. Thanks.
Yeah, so the Rathmullen was odd, wasn't it? Because the first episode is to do with Neolithic, and yet we start out with the Bronze Age in Rathmullen. And I can't remember why we did that even. Why it was a good, I suppose because it was near Mount Sandal and where, you know, the very first settlers came in. But it's like the DNA is still tricky. So we know that the second lot of people, you know, the first people who came 10,000 years ago and were here for 4,000 years, they seem to have, these are the ones with the blue eyes and the brown skin. And it's not quite sure. There were later groups of those. So wasn't it the second group came from the Middle East, came from Syria and Iraq and Egypt. But the first group seemed to have come from Russia and from the sort of the steppe and maybe the Slavic region. But then you're also, and some other people are talking about Eastern Turkey. So I think if we have another 5 or 10 years, the DNA will be a lot clearer. And certainly my grasp of it isn't great. So I can't give you a clear answer at the moment.
Yeah, I would just say in that regard that there are papers, and I may share links to them on the Mythical Ireland Facebook page later. There are papers that can be downloaded about especially about the newer revelations about movements, because all of this has rewritten what we knew a decade ago. Only 10 years ago, we thought the Irish population were descended from Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, and we now know that in fact most of the modern population are descended from the Beaker Bronze Age culture that arrived immediately after Newgrange and the Neolithic culture. But that's a great question, Blaheen, and we'll certainly try to get an answer for you at some stage in the near future. Anyone else quickly want to throw their hand in the air? Or Adrienne Hume is there. Hello.
Hi, thank you. That was wonderful. It just struck me the other night watching another travel program, and it has struck me before the similarities in the facial features of people from Mongolia, for example. I look at them and they remind me so much of people from Kerry and Cork, the type of faces, the bone structure. So that fits into what you're just saying there.
Interesting. Yeah, intriguing. Yeah, I can't wait. I can't wait for another decade when a lot of this hopefully will all knit into place and we will get a better sense of all this.
Yeah. Una Sheehan, who I mentioned earlier. Could you ask Manchán if his aunt was Cecilia Rahali of UCD? I think he did say that earlier on. We just confirmed that of UCD 1970 because Una graduated at the same time.
Oh, so yeah, so that was Celia O'Reilly. So Cecil O'Reilly was my cousin, who was the sister of T.F. O'Reilly. And
okay.
Celia O'Reilly is a relation of mine and a relation of Cecil's as well. And Celia was an architect an archaeologist on some very important digs. And she's still living in Limerick at the moment, but she is indeed my cousin. Yeah, my second cousin.
Brilliant. And maybe can we take one more? I'm just looking for, has anybody got a hand up?
What's the phrase to make dogs go away again?
Bulawalia. Bulawalia.
Bulawalia. Okay, thank you.
Joan McHugh wants to ask a question. Joan, I'll just ask to unmute there. You can unmute yourself there.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Hi, Manchán. Hi, Anthony.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, I listened to some of your podcasts recently, and I understand that you went down to the Cave of Cats, and I heard all about it, like no torch and the darkness, and how blissful it was to a certain degree. But I'm just curious, would you ever consider, because I can see a rebel in you, or a kind of a traveler, would you ever consider the likes of going out west to see if High Brazil or any of those islands off the west coast, off the coast of Ireland actually existed? If you got the chance, like deep sea diving or whatever, would you ever consider that?
Yeah, someone has actually offered me an opportunity to go on a boat in this year, this early summer, in search of High Brazil.
Oh, brilliant.
Now, I don't know, is it going to come across? They contacted me last November, and they want to put, I think, 6 or 7 artists on a ship and set them out and looking for High Brazil. And I don't know, have they got funding for the project? I've just actually, I'm writing a chapter on High Brazil at the moment for my book. So yeah, it's a lovely idea, like to go off on looking for something that may not exist. But as you say, podcast, the Almanac of Ireland, where I go. So where I go down into looking at Oiv Nagat, I spend time in the cave of this cave of transformation. So Oiv, so the Almanac of Ireland is this podcast that I have. I do it for RTE, and it's on, as you know, but I'm just telling other listeners in case they don't know, that it's a podcast that looks at these areas of heritage and culture. And mostly what I try and do is I try and put myself in, rather than doing proper research. So for example, for May Day, when you're meant to go out and roll in the May Day dew, I did exactly. I just take all my clothes off and go rolling around my field here outside the door in Westmeath and see, do I get any benefit? So it's a bit like, what was it, Jackass? It's like Jackass does culture, but you'll find that the Almanac of Ireland on any podcast feed. Yeah, but thank you. Thanks for the High Brazil. I had forgotten about it. I hope your man comes back to me with to tell me that they did get funding. That'd be so much fun.
I'd love if you did. It would be incredible. Whether it exists or not, it would be wonderful. I have a feeling it does exist, and just the tides have risen.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
If we've time for one more, I think Peter Woods. Peter, are you there? Do you want to ask a question?
Thank you.
No, thanks, Joan. I think I did ask you to unmute. Can you unmute yourself, Peter? Or are you still there? Ah, there you go.
Anthony, hello.
How are you?
Sorry, we're sitting here. The fire is after dying down. Thanks very much, Manchán, for the conversation. It was very enjoyable.
Thank you.
We have a question. Is there anybody monitoring the interaction between students in secondary school and primary school with the Irish language in the context of the things that you uncover going forward? Like, is there anybody kind of generating a master plan of how we're actually going to get back to some kind of modern day conversational Irish that's not English Irish?
Mm-hmm.
Great question.
Yeah, I'd say, so before this, when I was writing the book, about 2 years ago, I came out with a show called Iran Magazine, which I'll do again as soon as COVID lifts. I should start doing it. And what I do is I bake sourdough bread and the audience churn butter, and I talk about these ideas. I talk about how the language and the connection the land has with the language has with the land and our soul and our spirit. And bread is a really good medium to do that, because in bread you are taking the flour from Irish fields, the water from Irish rivers, the salt from the Irish Sea, mixing it with the magic yeasts, and these bacteria and microbes that have always been there to create a bread that rises. So it's a perfect metaphor. Now I wrote, and I did that, I toured Ireland with it about 2 years ago, and I went to all the Abbey and Cork and everywhere. And the first time I did in the Abbey, this bloke came up for me from the UCD School of Education. And he says to me, like, all of those concepts, we need to get them into the department. And he said he was the UCD School of Education who works with the Department of Education for new curricula. And said, this can all be the beginning of something new. But I get very sort of exhausted after my theatre show and sort of tune out. So I said to him, look, I can't hear you now, but maybe email me, because you're not even able to take in the information after a show. But of course, I never got his contact. I forgot. But I do know people from the teaching college in St. Pat's in Dublin, they are now reading this book And I know that, Michael D likes the book. So it won't be long. And as I said, I'm not the only person. I just have, my books happens to be in the attention at the moment, but a lot of people are doing these same things, like, Snuddies, and a lot of people are finding new ways to get all this information, and Anthony through his website. So what you're going to see starting now almost is the department putting together, they'll have to, a new way of using these tools to talk about the language in the new way. And hopefully my book about children's words and words that would really engage a child's mind might help with that. So I feel confident this will become part of education, but we need to be a bit patient.
Brilliant.
Super. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks, Peter. At this stage, Manchán, sorry, just altering the views here. At this stage, I think we will say thank you for your time. I'm going to put you on the spot. I'd love for you to come back and do another episode. I think there's a more free-flowing conversation without scripting and questions that needs to happen. So perhaps we can
Definitely. Yeah. I see that Tina Claffey, the great bog photographer, was asking there for bog words, and luckily she didn't ask me because I'd forgotten them all. But yeah, I've collected like dozens and scores of words for this beautiful peatland words. One thing that I didn't get to say, when you were saying about Moneymore beside you, and how Moneymore is a bog and there was a hidden town beneath it. So the Caillte Fields up in North Mayo, and the Caillte Fields is a bog, and then they strip the bog away and find the largest Stone Age site in the world, or in Europe anyway, underneath that entire habitation. And we know that, and at the moment, let's say Cardigan Bay off Wales, you have this entire bog that covered a forest, and when the sea is stripping back the sand, you're finding the bog. Often we find villages and habitations and whole farm and dwelling systems beneath bogs that could easily have been a bog, a settlement, a large settlement underneath the bog of Moneymore, underneath the peat.
Yeah, it has me just intrigued, because I know that we have to be very careful with mythology, because mythology serves as metaphor and allegory and all that. But quite often there are, I think, memories. There's so many stories attached to Brunabonia about a flood, Murahevna, the land covered by the sea, the great sea monster. There are the myth about the Mata, sounds like a glaciation myth. Garro Krulek and many others have pointed out about the Caillte, that she has this this very ancient memory that describes tectonic movements. And when you compare it to, say, Aboriginal oral beliefs about the past and the geography of their country and how they may have remembered things over tens of thousands of years, suddenly you get the feeling that, it sounds kind of shivers up your spine, gets the hairs tingling on the back of my neck, the feeling that maybe, just maybe, somewhere in that little story is a shred of truth about something, just like the Caillte Fields. Maybe Moneymore is sitting on something amazing.
Maybe so.
But anyway, Manchán, we could definitely talk all night, and would be delighted, really thrilled to have you back again. As I said, perhaps just for a more free-flowing conversation, to let it go down rabbit holes. Very grateful to everyone who turned up tonight. Before you go, it's very important that you tell us, where do people support you? Where do people find you? And most importantly, where do they buy your work that benefits you more so?
So the book 32 Words for Field, it's on sale on my website, but ideally get it from a local bookshop. I would love, luckily we haven't put it on sale in Amazon so far at all. But every one of your local bookshops will have it. It'll probably be cheaper to buy it in postage wise from your local bookshop. So I get it there, but you're welcome to get it from my bookshop, my website if you want. The little book, Sea Tamagotchi, the handmade book of sea words, that you'll get from either Red Fox Press, this tiny little printing house in Mayo, or again, my website, I'll sell it. But if you buy it from Red Fox Press, they wrap it beautifully. It'll be more beautiful if you get it from them. If you get it from me, it'll probably be signed. The Almanac of Ireland, my podcast, you'll find on any podcast feed, but there'll be a link to that on my website. My website is manchan.com, which is manchan.com. So yeah, and then Sea Tamagotchi, all these words every day, I'm putting them on Twitter and on Instagram. And then you know, I have tiny recordings of all the fishermen describing all of these words, and they're all on manchn.com as well.
Yeah.
So I don't have any more TV series, I think, coming up at the moment, no, but I will have more episodes of the Almanac of Ireland soon enough.
So manchn.com is the key. And of course, if you're on Twitter or you're on Instagram, folks, Manchán Magan, at Manchán Magan. And there's no fada. Thankfully, you've made it easy for people. MANCHANMAGAN, isn't it? At Manchán Magan. I just pasted that in as a comment there. Please do your best to support his wonderful work. Manchán, it's been an absolute thrill and a delight. So happy that you took up on the invitation. So happy that you've enjoyed yourself. And clearly everyone else has enjoyed themselves too. Tracy, I wonder, will we do the usual? I think Tracy usually unmutes everyone just so we can all say Ikawa, August, Kolosov and all the rest.
Absolutely. Everybody unmute yourselves and let's hear all your voices.
Good night.
Thank you. That was so
Thank you. Good to see everybody.
Long before. Don't forget that the regular Live Irish Myths on Wednesday will be about Imbolc and probably aspects of St. Bridget's Day as well. Tomorrow night I'm on the I'm doing that talk for the what's that city in the far west of Canada? Vancouver St. Bridget's celebrations. I'm out of action tomorrow, but Wednesday evening I'll do an ordinary episode. No ordinary, there's nothing ordinary about the episode. We'll do a regular episode about Imbolc and St. Bridget's Day. So I'm looking forward to seeing you all then. I thought Manchán was absolutely terrific, really engaging.
Fantastic.
I've got to get him back. Started really, you know. Yeah.
In together. Conversations.
Yeah, you're part of the tour now. You got to come back.
It's so lovely to see all the faces. I'm beginning to put faces to names that I've never known. Anyway, good night, everybody, and we'll see you. Wednesday will be the usual time, 8 p.m. So 3 p.m. Eastern.
Thank you so much.
12 noon Pacific, and we'll see you all then. Manchán, if you're still there, I'm not sure if Manchán is still there.
Yes, he is.
Oh, okay, Manchán, what a pleasure it's been. Really, hats off, and thank you for being a wonderful guest.
Thank you so much, Auntie.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Long, August Bannock.